I hope it's clear for all.
Yes, you can start.
Okay. So I am Jaafer M, Sabbar, a fourth stage medical student at Al Anbar University previously, and right now I'm in Jaafer Ibn Hayyan, taking practical, let's say, practical study. Today I will present the spinal cord vasculature. First, I prefer to start with the anatomy of the spinal cord. First, the spinal cord, as we know, the spinal cord will begin in the level of the, or sorry, okay. This one begin after the foramina magnum as here, and then run downward vertically in the vertebral column, and then will be ended at the tapered part of the spinal cord, which is called the conus medullaris at the level of the L1, L2, and the cauda equina. Does my voice clear for all? Sorry.
Yes, clear. Continue.
Okay, sorry. So as I mentioned, the spinal cord will be ended at the conus medullaris and will continue to the cauda equina. Here we show that there is a certain anterior groove along the anterior part of the spinal cord, running longitudinally downward. It's called the anterior median fissure. Posteriorly, we have another sulcus or another shallow sulcus. It is called the posterior spinal sulcus. Okay, so it is narrow as shown in the cross-sectional area. It is narrow, and then we have an anterior spinal fissure. Also, I will explain first, second, the anatomy of the or cross-sectional anatomy of the spinal cord to take a full picture about the anatomy of the spinal cord and the longitudinal and the cross-sectional anatomy. And then I will link it with the blood vessel to take a full idea about the anatomy and the blood vessel of the spinal cord. So in the cross-sectional area, the spinal cord is composed from the white matter externally and the gray matter internally, which is take H shape connected together by the way of the let's say gray commissure. Anterior we have, as I mentioned previously, anterior median fissure, and posteriorly we have the shallow sulcus. It's called the posterior median sulcus. Okay. So what's about the blood vessel of the spinal cord? So let's imagine that our heart is located here. As we know, the heart will give many great vessels at the arch of aorta and so one of these vessels. One of these vessels is subclavian arteries, right and left subclavian artery. The right and left subclavian artery will give many branches. And one of these branches is a vertebral artery, right? It's left and right vertebral arteries. These vertebral arteries will running upward vertically in the transverse foramina of the cervical vertebrae to reach the first cervical vertebrae, and then will be enter the cranium by the way of the foramina magnum. After these two arteries entering the foramina magnum at the level of the pons, they will be unit to form a single artery or one artery. It's called the basilar artery, and then the basilar artery will finally or eventually divided into the posterior cerebral artery. This is about the anatomy of the blood vessels. So why I mentioned, because it's have a specific relationship or have a relationship with the anatomy of the blood vessel of the spinal cord. Before these two vertebral arteries giving the basilar artery, they give a short arteries that from the left and right that unit together and form the anterior spinal artery. These anterior spinal arteries, anterior spinal artery is a single artery, run downward vertically. Some reference say that it's run inside the anterior median fissure, and some reference say that it's run in front of anterior median fissure. So it's run downward vertically, as I say. Okay. The vertebral arteries before unit also give another artery. This is another artery. It's contribute to the, let's say, cerebellum. Okay, this is called the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. And then after unit, it's give another artery contribute to cerebellum. It's called the anterior inferior cerebellar artery. IK and BIK. And the reason why I am mentioned that those or these arteries, because some reference say that the posterior spinal arteries, we have two posterior spinal arteries. The two posterior spinal arteries, some reference say that it's arises from the BIK, posterior and inferior spinal artery, and then run downward vertically on the posterior part of the spinal cord on each side of the posterior, let's say, posterior median sulcus. Okay. As shown in the second picture, sorry if it's not good, it's resolution, but I will clarify with my laser pointer. This is two vertebral artery unit to give a basilar artery before, two vertebral artery before giving a basilar artery, give BIK, and BIK will give, this is little or small arteries. It's called the posterior spinal arteries as shown here, and also give anterior spinal arteries as shown here. So this is about the longitudinal arteries or vertical arteries of the spinal cord as shown here. One anterior spinal artery and two posterior spinal artery on each side of the posterior median sulcus. Okay, so this is a spinal artery. How to contribute, or how it can contribute to the spinal cord. It's contribute to the spinal cord by the small arteries or branched arteries. It's called the sulcal arteries, as shown here. These sulcal arteries contribute to the anterior two-thirds of the spinal cord. And how the posterior spinal artery will contribute to the spinal cord. It's also another sulcal artery which is contribute to the posterior one-third of the spinal cord. So by the way of the sulcal artery, the anterior spinal cord, it's contribute to anterior two-thirds of the spinal cord. By the way of the sulcal artery, the posterior spinal artery will contribute to the posterior one-third of the spinal cord. This is about the vertical arteries or arteries that run vertically and supply the spinal cord. So what's about the, let's say, the arteries that supply each segment of the spinal cord, or let's say it's the arteries that supply the cross section or the transverse section of the spinal cord. Actually, these arteries will arise from different locations, depending on which level of the spinal cord we take. If we take the, let's say, the thoracic level, it arises from the posterior intercostal arteries. Okay. The posterior, let's say this is posterior here. This is the posterior, let's say, posterior intercostal artery. The posterior intercostal artery will then give a branch. This is, let's say, this posterior spinal posterior intercostal artery give a branch. This is a branch. It's called. This is a branch. It is called, as I'm showing with my laser pointer, it's called the segmental spinal artery. This segmental spinal artery enter to the spinal cord by the way of the intervertebral foramen and enter along with the nerve root. Along with the spinal artery, and then we'll divide it into anterior branch and posterior branch. The anterior branch is called the anterior radicular artery, and posterior branch is called the posterior radicular artery. Okay. This is occur in the segment of the spinal cord. In certain segment, especially the segment of the cervical segment and lumbar segment, these segment of those segments that contribute to high motility of our body. These segment, there is another arteries that arises from the segmental spinal arteries. As shown here, there is posterior radicular artery, anterior radicular artery. But there is another arteries, one anterior, one posterior, especially at the cervical and lumbar area. This is artery, it's called the segmental medullary artery, or another way we can call it anterior spinal medullary artery and posterior spinal medullary artery. This is not present in all segments of the spinal cord, but it's mainly present in the, let's say, cervical and lumbar area of the spinal cord, the area of high motility to contribute to more blood supply to this area. Okay, this is also show it's vary between the pupil. It's vary between the number of these blood vessels. It's vary between the pupil. Okay. The interesting thing here, these have a certain diameter. The greater diameter, the artery of the greater diameter of the medullary arteries, or the anterior medullary artery, which have the greater diameter, it's called the Adam-Kivich artery. This Adam-Kivich artery will be present in the, actually specifically in the lower thoracic and upper lumbar area to contribute to this area. So, as shown, or as I explained previously, we have the anterior radicular and posterior radicular, anterior medullary or anterior segmental medullary, anterior posterior segmental medullary. Okay, the largest anterior segmental medullary, it is called the Adam-Kivich artery, and the reason why it's called the Adam-Kivich artery, because it's discovered by the Sir Albert Adam-Kivich, so it is called the Adam-Kivich artery. There is another name. It's actually it's called the greater segmental medullary artery. Okay, this is about the arterial supply of the spinal cord, and this is a full picture of the arterial supply of the spinal cord. Here we can see that two vertebral arteries contribute to anterior spinal artery. Vertebral arteries or posterior and inferior arteries will contribute into two posterior spinal artery alongside the posterior median sulcus, and then continue downward. And then we have also the radicular, let's say, the segmental spinal artery contribute to the anterior and posterior radicular artery, and the anterior and posterior segmental medullary artery, and the Adam-Kivich artery. This is about the arterial supply. So what about the venous supply of the spinal cord? Actually, many references say that there is a three anterior about the venous system, three anterior spinal veins and three posterior spinal veins. And these veins will drain the blood from the spinal cord, will communicate and anastomose and drain the blood from the spinal cord by the way of the anterior and posterior radicular artery, or let's say another arteries, these veins anastomose and drain the blood by the way of the anterior and posterior radicular veins and anterior and posterior medullary segmental veins. And then by the way of the intervertebral veins, it will drain into these plexus located epidurally or extradurally. It is called the internal venous plexus. The internal venous plexus, and the internal venous plexus as shown here will be drained into another plexus. It's called the posterior, or it's called, external venous plexus. So this is internal venous plexus drained to the external venous plexus, and the external venous plexus will be drained the blood according to the level of the spinal cord. So it's the level, its lumbar will drain into the lumbar arteries, and also like the ascending lumbar, drain into lumbar veins, and also into ascending lumbar veins. If it's in the thoracic level, it will drain to azygos, hemiazygos, and if it's in cervical level, it will be drained into the vertebral vein, and so on. As we say, this, if it's in the thoracic, drain into hemiazygos, azygos. Hemiazygos, it will be continuing to the left brachiocephalic vein, and the azygos will contribute to the, or continue into the superior vena cava, and then going to the heart, and the process will be occur. Before I end my presentation, I wanted to say thanks from deepest part from the deepest part of my heart to my supporter and my mentor, Dr. Samer Hoz, for everything. So I am really thankful for him. If anyone has a question. Anyone has a question?
If anyone has a question, please raise your hand. Mm,
So there is no one have any question.
Thank you, Jaafer.